Thank you, David. That was so lightweight, I don't know if we're going to have anything to talk about. We got NFL advertising, a push at pelvic matters, General Kelly quoting Pharaoh, entertaining kitsch. Did bother me with a comment about beer, but my friend Britt Norval pointed me this afternoon to a quote by the poet Chris Wyman. He says at one point in his memoir, My Bright Abyss, he asks, "What is poetry's role when the world is burning? Encroaching environmental disaster, the relentless wars around the world have had, it seems, a paralyzing effect on much American poetry. It's less the magnitude of the crises than our apparent immunity to them. This death on which we all thrive, that's spinning our best energies into esoteric language games. There is some fury of clarity," he says, "that's much needed now. But it sometimes seems that we're anxiously waiting for the devastation to reach our very streets, as it one day will. It most certainly will," he says. So with his question of what's poetry's role when the world is burning, and your suggestion of this sort of envisioning the preaching task as a poetic one, it seems like we can ask the question, really, though? In the midst of all this, are we supposed to take preaching that seriously? How would you kind of respond to what Wyman puts out there?
Well, if we don't take it seriously, we're out of business. So that's a thought. If what I've said about the totalism is roughly correct, and we're not going to vote on it, what the totalism wants to do is to shut down all dissent. And you can see it happening, the way in which the right wing has taken over the courts and everything else. And poetry is an act of huge resistance against that. And I must say, I get around to a lot of different local congregations. I almost never spend a weekend in a congregation that somebody doesn't hand me a poem they've written. And it's usually women. It's usually people who are not on the top side of the totalism. So it makes life porous, and it's a refusal of closure. And a refusal of closure is what Easter is all about. What Easter declared is that Caesar can't do closure, even though Caesar tried and thought he could. And we now live in a society of people who think you can do closure. And everything is at stake in insisting otherwise.
Somewhat related to that, in your first point about the force of totalism, you had this line where you said you were talking about the necessity or the task of critiquing militarism and nationalism in our churches, and you provoked us with this line, "You cannot do it, and you must." Is that a line mostly just about courage?
Well, it's a line about realism about budgets and all that. I'm very serious about thinking in most churches I know you cannot do it. I worship in an Episcopal church, and my preacher understands all of this very clearly and will not do it. And I understand why he won't do it. And I think he's getting to the point where he knows he must. So I think if we decide to do this in a sustained way, we are breaking with the American tradition that churches ought to be big, and are making a decision that it's more important that churches be faithful because very much of the big part of the church isn't participatory in the mission anyway. So I don't take that lightly. I know about institutional realities, but I think these are questions that we increasingly have to think about.
So how do you suggest we go about envisioning doing such tasks in a way that's not immediately discounted and then it's just kind of strident, because, for example, put you in most churches in the Bible Belt,
Yeah,
there's going to be one simple response to you.
I know that.
You're a socialist.
I know that.
So how does one subvert the ease of dismissal?
Well, I think two things. First of all, I think you whatever work you do about this, you do in small study groups. You don't do in the public meeting, because in small study groups, people presumably have wanted to be there, and they didn't happen in accidentally on Sunday morning. The other thing is that you have to do a long-term education of showing that every text, I think every text has a public dimension. And people don't know that. And people don't know that because we've taught them a very reductionist gospel about me and Jesus. So it really has to do with thinking through our hermeneutical perspective so that we are always showing how texts are doing systems analysis. And it isn't about me and him. So I think you have to make the case about that kind of analysis of texts before you do anything frontal about our contemporary crisis. That's how my mind works about it. And I don't think that's easy.
Yeah. And finally comes the poet. You noted the crisis of interpretation the preacher faces in our culture, which has either dismissed or controlled the text. In the open lines of prophetic imagination, you argue the contemporary American church is so largely enculturated to the American ethos of consumerism that it has little power to believe or to act. Revised edition 2001. Again, you say the enmeshment of the United States church and the raging force of globalization, the easy accommodation of church faith and practice, consumer commoditism, makes the urgency of prophetic consciousness palpable among us.
That would mean that I haven't had a new thought in 40 years.
Thank you. I can move on now. That's what one of my friends in grad school said. The way you become a great scholar is you write a dissertation and you write it over and over again.
That's right. That's right.
So do you feel even less hopeful 18 years even after that in the changing situation in the United States? Or where do you see some hope, or where do you see only despair, or where is that for you?
I see modest hope because I think more and more people are aware that this isn't working. And we cannot, I think people don't know what to do, but people know we can't keep doing this. I think people know that. I don't think people want it talked about, but I think people know it. I mean, just the simple recognition that middle class people know that it's not going to be as good for their grandchildren as it is for them. What's wrong with this picture? And it's because all the wealth is monopolized.
You talk a bit about, you mentioned several times tonight that both liberal and conservatives in the church are contained in this totalizing, same ideology. Talk more about that, because I think a lot of people assume that those are so very far apart from each other.
Well, first of all, I think that totalism is so powerful that it contains us all. But I don't want to be a liberal who bashes conservative Christians, because I mostly live with liberal Christians, and most liberal Christians I know are very good about social justice as long as it does not critique the system. Because very many liberals are really well off and have a great stake in the system. So our thinking about justice basically has to do with rearranging things in the capitalist system rather than doing a neighborly critique of the system. So there are real limits to that way of thinking gospel-wise. So I think that progressive and conservative Christians have different strategies for negotiating our ambiguity about the totalism of the gospel. And I don't think that one of those strategies is superior to the other, though I happen to have my own commitments.
Can I ask you a couple of relatively, not terribly personal, but somewhat kind of thinking about personal application? One comes to mind is you have been doing this sort of work a long time with all of the challenges that come with it. As a scholar, as a preacher, as one under the word, however we want to put that, have you had times where you've thought about quitting?
I'm thinking about quitting with waning energy and old age. But if you mean, had I thought about quitting because I thought it wasn't worth it or something, no, that did not occur to me. If anything, I feel more and more urgent about it because I think we are in a ever diminished situation. Yeah.
So imagine you're talking to a young mentee who's in his 20s or she's in her 30s, and they're grappling with feeling the sense of being so overwhelmed by all of this. Give some grandfatherly wisdom.
Well, my grandchildren do not want any, so. Well, two things off the top of my head. First of all, you cannot do that alone. You got to find some allies that are sustaining. And the second thing is, most of the pastors I know, they need to know more than they know. They need to know more about social theory and social criticism, and that means reading. So there's a literature you have to do if you're going to practice a hermeneutic of public awareness about the biblical text. And most of the seminaries I know have only very recently begun to think about doing that at all. We were so, both liberals and conservatives were so mesmerized by historical questions. Conservatives wanted to be sure it really happened, and liberals wanted to be sure it really didn't. It doesn't go anywhere. So I think historical questions are simply a dead end, and they don't help us. That's what I think. So when I look back at my long teaching career, I spent much too long on historical questions because that's sort of what the Guild required of me.
We're deeply grateful for your work and your witness, and we thank you. So I'm going to ask two things. One, I'm going to ask that we show gratitude just through some applause, and then after that, I've got one closing act against the totalism I would like to do. So thank you first.